Well, I wanted to make pants for trees, and then because I kind of, like I said, I fell in love with trees, and I thought trees might need some underwear. So I kind of made these big, huge pants. You can kind of see on them, there's fire and kind of talking about my Acadian background, things burning. But I think they look way better on trees than they do on me. Bonjour, mon nom c'est François Gaudet et je suis maintenant à la Galerie d'Art à Acadia. This exhibition here at the Acadia Art Gallery is like walking into my mythic living room. It's not really my living room, but it's kind of the living room in my head. The idea of house or home is almost a really integral part to my work because as an Acadian, most of my work formally tries to articulate a homeland because my ancestors lost their homelands. You can say I'm going to visit Acadie, but Acadie doesn't exist because it's not really, there's no borders right now. There's not a place called Acadie, but quite often people will go to visit Acadian places. I am 100% Acadian. I feel Acadian, but I can't really quite explain it. I think it's a language. I think it's a song. I think it's music. I think it's food. My Acadian identity, I think, can really manifest itself quite powerfully in my artwork. Again, this whole show is kind of articulating a homeland, or you're walking into my living room. So I pushed that even a little bit further by this is actually my shower curtain. And one thing I like about the shower curtain, it's a reference to a Life magazine. And at a time, every photographer, including myself, wanted to be in that magazine. So again, I think it's a little bit of a humor part to it. So I actually put it on a curtain rod so you can pull it open and reveal a little bit of story about the Acadian horses. There's a disc here too, Tout, Passe, talking about the Acadians, the song they actually sang when they were being deported. The deportation was kind of a pivotal point in the Acadians because they were all over Acadie. Acadie was not just in Nova Scotia, it was a whole huge tract of land, which also encompassed parts of Maine, parts of Quebec, Gaspésie. And in 1755, by the Acadians refusing to sign an oath of allegiance, pledging allegiance to the king at the time. There was these big wars going on, the 7-Year War, the French-Indian War. So the British were kind of a little bit nervous that if these Acadians would side maybe with the French, that it would make them a little bit more powerful to overthrow maybe the British. And they decided they had to sign an oath of allegiance to side with the British. The Acadians naturally did not want to do that because it would make the Mi'kmaq, which were their best friends, their enemy, and also the French. So by refusing to sign the oath of allegiance, 1755, September 5th, the British said, "You're prisoners of the king, and we're going to deport you to the 13 colonies." I think it was called Reverend Brown that documented, or didn't document the song, but documented the Acadians when they were deported. They sang a song, Tout, Passe. So Tout, Passe means everything's gonna pass, if you could translate it, which is quite powerful because even as they were being deported, they were being ripped away from their homelands, they were kind of singing. I'm incredibly visual. I like to see things. When I see things, that's the way I learn. That's the way I process. That's the way I filter this world or this life. There's a camera in back of me that, not the one my father gave me, but very similar to that way, that box, that magic box, that mythic eye, the way you look at things, the way things are framed, came from my father being a photographer. The region I come from is called Clare District. You know, a little bit later on in life, I realized that I grew up in an Acadian ghetto. So by this I mean, it's not a negative thing, it's a positive thing, but from these borders, the Acadians, when they were allowed to come back from the deportation after the Treaty of Paris in 1763, were allowed to come back to certain places in Nova Scotia, but not to places like they were before, like Grand Pré. In Digby County, my ancestors were given land in between Anglophone settlements, so they would become assimilated. I feel like being Acadian, I'm always caught between some polarities, between the French and the English, certainly language. A lot of my work will involve like two different things, like photography and painting. The photography, maybe something real happened. Painting speaks about itself, but when you combine both, this magic has to happen or can happen. I work also for Parks Canada at Grand Pré National Historic Site, and I was doing research one day and I found out that during the deportation of the Acadians in 1755, a sea captain, took some of the horses, the Acadian horses, and stashed them on Sable Island. And he continued his journey to Boston, where he died. So these horses that were stashed on Sable Island became wild. So for me, it was kind of a metaphor for survival, because I feel like they're my horses, or my ancestors' horses more specifically. They mixed in with other horses because that sandbar, Sable Island, they call it the shipwreck. There's a lot of shipwrecks there. So they kind of mixed in with other horses. So I wanted to tell that story through art. So these horses are made out of house wrap again, Tyvek. They're very strong. It's the rudimentary form of the horse, but I invited the public to come and paint with me. So maybe 300 or 400 people worked on these horses, and we would discover about the wild horses of Sable Island. Well, the story of Evangeline is quite a romantic story written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It's a tale of Acadie, and it's a story about a young girl, Evangeline, that lived in Grand Pré in 1755, was in love with Gabriel, and they were supposed to get married. So throughout that 1755, they were involved in the deportation. They were separated. They were deported to different areas. Evangeline decided to dedicate the rest of her life to find her Gabriel. You know, it's kind of a romantic story, but a lot of the facts in the poem were fairly accurate. So it kind of told the story of the Acadians. I wanted to work with appropriation. So I kind of worked with this image over and over again. A lot of people appropriate Evangeline for their own businesses. Here in the valley, we have Evangeline Funeral Home, Evangeline Camping Ground, Evangeline Mall, Evangeline Pop. A lot of people appropriated her. So hey, I appropriated her also. I wanted to put a block of text on her too, because in the poem, Evangeline doesn't speak very much. So this way, again, like the French curve, you can configure these letters and she can basically say anything she wants. So that's where the Evangeline came from. I just put it in front of Evangeline, put a Evangeline, so that, you know, maybe if she does come back, she'll be able to speak her mind, which might be pretty fascinating. These trees are a Grand Pré National Historic Site, which is kind of hollow grounds for the Acadians. It's kind of sacred ground because there's also a graveyard there. So I became kind of fascinated by these trees, and I kind of photographed them with a camera that does panoramics. So these ones will be panned up instead of across. So that way it was quite nice because you see the feet or the foot of the tree right up to the top of the tree. So that allowed me a little bit more of the tree, because trees are obviously vertical, and by photographing it that way, and by printing it like kind of in a nice narrow format, and the other ones printed the exact same picture but flipped and mirrored. And when that happened, eyes started to emerge, noses, mouths, a little bit here. Even here you kind of see this weird kind of wizard format, kind of a little bit of a cat-looking monster there. So I kind of became fascinated, because being on maybe graveyards, maybe these trees were starting to grow and trying to tell me something. Again, in my artistic head or in my artistic mind, these trees were being anthropomorphized. And that for me is very powerful, because when you look at an image, it talks to everybody in a different way. And also these trees kind of became like ink blots. So everybody look at them can maybe bring something else to it, see different things, which I really enjoy, because that brings in your being into these trees. Trees also, when they're cut down, have tree rings. So I became fascinated by the tree rings, because trees can talk. They can tell you about the summer of 1942 or the summer of 1979. By if it was wet or dry or climatology. So all of a sudden these trees, the tree rings, were manifested in the rings in the vinyls. So I started to work with these vinyls. I started to want to paint on them, to reinvent, to appropriate the story in the vinyls, because it's a natural progression. It's a beautiful circle. It's a beautiful disc. It harks back to the tree rings. It tells stories. And most of my artwork tells story. It's storytelling. Art is really important because it can move mountains. It can save people's lives. It can talk about people. It can make people listen. It can make people being compassionate. So either if you do art or look at art or participate in art, it's what makes us real, what makes us kind of think, what challenges us to be incredible So for me, art is in every fiber of my being. Without art, there will be no me.